Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Sacred Flame podcast. It is I, Matthias Nordvig, and I am, as always, joined by.
Amina Otto.
And today we have a very special guest with us. We have Gregory Amato, who is the author of the trilogy Spear of the Gods. And I am sitting here with, where did I put it? Uh, Burden to Bear, the um, one of the books in the trilogy here. And Gregory, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you for joining us. I think it's really exciting to talk to somebody who uh, authors Viking Age fiction because that is a um, an interesting thing to do overall, right? You're as an author, you're somewhere between history and fantasy typically when you're working with this kind of material. And I know that you have both used the saga literature that's available from medieval Iceland and Old Norse mythology to sort of build out your stories here. So I'm really psyched to talk to you about all of that.
Yeah, there are actually lots of good authors who have done this period with an eye toward history, and it's been entirely historical, maybe with a few nods towards slightly weird things that we would call magic or spirituality, maybe even gods appearing. But it was so bent toward history, and it was so most of what I read, at least, was not really leaning into spiritual beliefs of the time very hard at all. What I wanted was something that was more authentic as far as representing how those people thought about the other worlds, the other beings, the things that they weren't seeing, the religious and spiritual practices, the spell casting, and part of the reason I think that that's not in there is we don't have real good sources about how they practiced things. And so, being historical authors, they're very good on telling you about fighting kit. They're very good about telling you about ships and histories and even movement of peoples, things that we know from archaeology. But other than there was one series that I really liked, The Hammer and the Cross, which was by Harry Harrison, co-authored by a pseudonymous named Ian Holm, I think, but Ian Holm is not Ian Holm. Ian Holm is Dr. Tom Shippey, who knows quite a bit about things. There you had more involvement with gods, specifically, kind of an idea in the background there, and then intervening at times. But when I wanted to do it, or when I did it, I really wanted to lean that much more heavily into the fantasy aspects. Not necessarily because everybody is like, yeah, I'll just run into a dwarf who will make me a magic sword because this was common. These weren't common things, but because nobody else was doing this, I wanted to include a lot of those elements. I wanted to basically write a new legendary saga, but it had to be written in a more modern way because the sagas in general, legendary or the Icelandic sagas or whatever sagas, they don't tend to tell you too much internal thought. They don't tend to tell you about feelings. You're left to wonder why somebody did something a lot of the time, and you're wondering how they reacted to different aspects. That's not really, I don't think that's something that modern fantasy readers would accept. Certainly, it's not something I wanted. And when I had that idea, it fit really well, all these elements together. That said, because we don't have those clear written records of how they did the things they did and why, it's pretty hard. You've got to piece together all kinds of different peripheral things. Then you need to make some decisions, and I address that in a bunch of different ways at different parts of the series.
Yeah.
Hmm. That was going to be one of my questions is what has kind of helped to anchor you in your negotiation of figuring out how to bring these characters about whom we don't have much internal monologue to life for a modern reader and how to fill in the space left between the textual and material culture that's available to us and infuse it with that kind of enchantment at magic that's so forward in
Yeah.
your books.
Yeah. So one thing I did not want to do was this kind of glomming my present onto the past. The past
Hmm.
is has its own people with its own way of thinking. Um, we can't reconstruct. We don't know how they cast spells, for example, in a lot of ways, but we also don't know how they thought about things. And so applying some of the actions to our modern ways of thinking just aren't appropriate. You really have to try to reconstruct that mindset or mindsets because it wouldn't have been static over time or over place.
Right.
But there might have been some commonalities. Now, Neil Price was a really good source for thinking about that because he wrote a very, very extensive textbook looking at archaeology, looking at saga literature, looking at myths, and trying to bring that together into a coherent explanation of mindset. I think you can get some of that from just reading the literature and using empathy. Hopefully, this is what we get when we a little bit more when we read, as we think about not how we would react in certain situations, but like how would this person react? Like this person doesn't have your values, doesn't have your way of thinking about the future necessarily. And this person isn't thinking about Valhalla as an equivalent to your heaven. That is a major, major mistake. That is a huge example of presentism. However, some similarities there might be like you die and you go to this other place and it's cool. And I mean, it's undeniably cool. They drink meat and eat at night and then they fight all day. And then they just keep doing it again. So yeah, it's cool. It's not like heaven. And not everyone, not all the battle slain go there.
Hmm.
And the alternative is not punishment. It's just different. Even though it is called hell, Hel, just one L, it's not a place of torment, damnation. As far as I can tell, and again, we don't know this for sure, but I'm sure you could speak more to this, Matthias. My understanding is hell is probably just the realm of the dead
Hmm.
in general, and not necessarily this place specifically. Although we do get some references to like Niflhel
Hmm.
down below. So
Yeah,
yeah, go
so
ahead.
if I yeah, let me just like do the encyclopedic rundown. Right? Yeah, I mean the word hell literally means covered or something hidden. Um from Proto-Germanic halio. And that's the same root as the word cellar, right? So it's like something down below ground, right?
Yeah.
And it's probably the original conception of the other world, the underworld, where you go when you
Hmm.
die. And I think the most likely situation was that they pretty much saw that place as the same or similar to where we are here when we are alive. Um, if we reference with like Greek and Roman literature, it's a similar situation, right? Like a king is still a king in the underworld. He hasn't changed his position in life or swapped anything out, so to speak, right? And I think if we, consider all the grave goods that are present in Viking Age graves, right, we can easily see that they had a similar conception of all of this. That you go to the underworld with all these cool things if you have them. If you don't have them, then you don't get them, right? This is why some people are buried in massive ships,
Hmm.
adorned with ornamentation and sacrifices and all kinds of cool things. And other people are put in a grave with maybe just a horse and a spear and such, right? And so I actually think this is my personal theory. I know that there are other scholars out there that are definitely going to support it, and then there are also scholars that are definitely going to reject it because that's Old Norse mythology. That's like a baseline. You always have a bunch of people arguing about details. But I think um Valhalla. is probably in the underworld too. I don't think it's
Oh,
anywhere up there or out there or something like that. I think Valhalla is actually, and this is why like there's like in the literature this focus on the location and then the hall in the location, and I think it's actually also down there.
Mhm.
And there is one source, one literary source that seems to suggest this, and that is Saxo's History of the Danes, where we have this tour of the underworld where Hattingus, this Danish king, he's being taken by a vulva through the underworld, and she shows him all of these different places. A lot of it is definitely very closely inspired by elements from the prophecy of the seeress. And then she also, at one point, she shows him that plane where the Einherjar are fighting, and she says they're fighting for eternity. So, this could also just be like a Christian author who just like takes everything and puts it down there. But I actually think that it might be an original idea because
yeah.
all the other indications that we have from the archaeological material or remains, and from the references to where the underworld is, norther neither, right? So north and
Mhm.
down. Everything seems to indicate that Valhalla is actually also in the underworld.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's those are my 2 cents on that one.
You talk about the disagreements, and it kind of, regardless of, who's right, who's wrong, it kind of goes to the fact that anybody approaching this really has to have high tolerance for ambiguity. And it, everybody in popular culture, uh, less so me because I was trying to be a little bit more ambiguous, they want to present Norse mythology as like this is the way it was,
Hmm.
and I'm like, well, at what time and
And where?
what location? Because 10th century Sweden and 8th century Denmark, possibly very very different stories going on. Or even if you're telling the same story, you might have big variants. When you
Hmm.
see place names, certain gods appear in all over the place in one area and not at all in another. Some gods we can't even really explain. I mean, I was just reading, Matthias, actually your two contributions to the anthology Pre-Christian Religions of the North.
Mm.
So, for example, when presenting the Norse beginning of the world.
Hmm.
I think it's pretty consistently like, well, these three guys they killed Ymir the giant and they fashioned the world out of all of his pieces. And you remind us in the cosmogony chapter, well, actually, there's kind of two stories,
Hmm.
and one is that Midgard just got raised up
Hmm.
close to the sun, plants grew. It's like not the giant slaying, the same kind of thing. uh, were these stories complementary? Did they overlap at times, or were they very different variants? I mean,
Hmm.
those are really hard questions to answer, but just keep in mind, like, we're not talking about some kind of one version dogma, not even
No,
close.
no, and
Um,
I think this is, there are two reasons for that. One, you know, we come from traditions and societies that push that idea, the idea of
yep.
dogma, right? So that is unhelpful to us when we try to understand a society that was fundamentally different, which this one was, or these ones. And secondly, I think we simply just forget just how much variation you could get in that space. Just for reference, for especially for American listeners, the southern tip of Norway to the northern tip of Norway is the
Hmm.
distance from like Miami to New York, roughly. Right.
Yeah.
It's pretty far. And then you have Sweden as well. On the other side, you have the Danish area. You have the whole Finno-Baltic area over there to the east. Then you have Iceland. You have the British Isles to the extent that there's the overlap here and there with ideas and thoughts and so on. And then you also have Greenland eventually, right? And Greenland, again, just for reference, Greenland is the size of a third of the US, which is pretty damn huge,
Yeah.
right? Um, so all of these areas with so much space in between them and so many different peoples and um, so many different ways of living as well, like must have generated a lot of differences overall. And then you have this guy or a couple of guys, I guess, in Iceland in the 13th century who are like, yeah, we're going to write down the part of all of this, all of these stories
Yeah.
that we find most important. We're not going to record all of it because
Hmm.
that's definitely not what they did. There are many factors that involve that situation, right? One is they don't know all of the stories. They don't know the stories that are told in different parts of Sweden or Denmark. That's for sure. What they do know are the stories that are told in Western Norway and Northern Norway specifically.
Hmm.
And then they sift through those uh, and tell the ones that are most important to them. So like multiple levels of selection too, right?
Yeah.
And so that's how we end up with this. And then, of course, on top of that, you have Snorri Sturluson, who's also like, and now I need to synthesize all of this with like Christian theology and my philosophical training about like Neoplatonic philosophy, that kind of stuff, right? So,
Yeah.
wow, that's a lot to deal with, actually.
Yeah, and while a lot of that was probably, I think, was probably pretty unwelcome. I'm glad he wrote it down, one, but let's be honest, like this stuff didn't just pop out of Scandinavia. I mean, it had influences a long time before Snorri was trying to impose his influences on it. And when you start to learn, which I thought I had known, I knew everything when I start, or I knew a lot when I started these books, but as I did more and more research, the more I realized I don't know, and probably I have just pages and pages of unanswerable questions. The time period that we're talking about, or that I'm talking about, isn't necessarily just the Viking Age, like 793 to 1066. That's fine for calling that age. I'm very interested in the migration era, which
Hmm.
is just prior to that, and what led to the migration era. And as I'm researching my newer series that I'm writing, which is earlier and set in northern England around Hadrian's Wall, what I'm reading about is Vikings in part. We don't call them Vikings, but especially around that time period, there were three Roman military bodies. One of them was the body that garrisoned Hadrian's Wall, and that was under one command. One was the mobile army, and that was, to move around as needed. But there was a third, and the third, I don't remember the exact name, but it was basically like it wasn't just the Coast Guard, it was like the guard against the Saxons. Because the Saxons kept coming up and raiding on the coasts there. And we're talking about, 300s AD and before that maybe. So also recall a lot of Germanic auxiliaries fought for the Western Roman Empire, a lot. And a lot of them would have gone home. And a lot of them would have
Mhm.
gone home with stories of Roman mythology, of Greek ideas, of many other kinds of influences that informed of Celtic ideas that they
Mhm.
got from Picts and Irish and Romano Britons.
But
These things.
even also
Mhm.
like in the Rhineland area, right? The
Yeah.
Rhineland area is that like this interface between three primary cultures. We have
Hmm.
Roman, we have
Hmm.
Celtic, and we have
Hmm.
Germanic, and they're like coming together in different ways. The Matrona cults that emerges around the year. well, just before the year zero, I think like this veneration of these three
Hmm.
female deities is a great example of that because sometimes they have Germanic names, sometimes they have Celtic names, sometimes
Hmm.
they, and they're all using Roman format for depictions and writing, and I mean, just a side note on all of that, you know, the first Germanic inscriptions that we have using Latin letters. Like, a lot of people are like hyped up about the runes and Germanic runes and all that kind of stuff, but the first Germanic inscriptions are in Latin letters.
Yeah.
And I think that's actually quite important to consider, right?
The
Same
runes are
with the
very
Celtic
cool. They
material
look
as
really
well.
cool.
Yeah.
The Celts were using Greek and Roman letters as well. And Ogham didn't come for several centuries after that. So
Hmm.
it's, yeah, it was all borrowing from this kind of very fused epicenter of culture. Yeah.
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 So I think I might have got off your question, Amina, and not fully answered it. But how do I address those people without, my stuff getting in on them? Well, first, I think there's kind of a few different parts to it. One is they're still people. They're still human beings.
Mhm.
They have wants and needs and desires. They have emotions, even if they're not not necessarily going to show them due to their culture. They have senses of humor. They have a sense of their own history, even if that's whether that's historical or just what they've experienced or what their parents told them or what legend tells them. And trying to get into the head of that is just thinking about what they would be maybe thinking about what they would be concerned about day to day because they can't just get food, they can't just get shelter. The natural elements are much more concerning. What their culture would demand of them would be very different. And so getting into that mindset and then thinking about the different time periods, uh, they're still human beings, but they're very different from me. And I always keep that in mind. And that means that while I'm willing to portray them, in this modern way where I give internal thought and motivations and I talk about emotions, which are totally like not in the sagas, because you don't generally get that. I do that in a way that I think would be right for them and not because it would be like, I really want this good guy to be more like me. It was a time where not all those people's values would be really acceptable to me.
Mhm.
That not all the culture is great. So what I did was my protagonists are the ones who favor the values that are of that time that I like. And the antagonists are largely the ones who either eschew those values or adopt values that of that time that I don't like. And either way, you're still being true to the time, but you can, if you really want, you could decide if the antagonists are the good guys and the bad guys are the protagonists. That's somewhat popular nowadays, but I don't favor that.
Mhm.
But it's picking and choosing what I like. I'm not saying you have to think that Arrow Odd is a good dude
Mhm.
based on his saga. I do think that he is. I do present him as complicated, and the reader can choose. Like, no, I think Arrowhead's a douchebag.
Mhm.
I don't think they're going to call him necessarily a douchebag at the time, but there might be some suggestions of that. But there are also good qualities of him. My good people, this goes back to most of what I write goes back to Beowulf, which is
Mm.
the same, much of the same source for Lord of the Rings and J.R.R. Tolkien, and Beowulf is many many things and has been written about so much in so many different ways. What I take from Beowulf, or one of the major things I take from Beowulf is here is the way we expect our champions, our leaders, our heroes to act. We
Mhm.
expect them to act like Beowulf. We expect them to act like Wiglaf,
Mhm.
the two characters that you you actually cannot place in history. Like you can place most of those names, maybe most of those names, if not most, but then very, very many of them you can place in history with some sort of reference, except for those two.
Hmm.
And the big contrast is near the end where Beowulf is fighting and he is losing and he is gonna
Hmm.
lose. And they are not gonna be able to save him. And Wiglaf says, we need to charge the dragon. And the other retainers are like, that sounds like a bad idea.
Hmm.
And Wiglaf explains at length that they why they need to do that. Like this armor he gave us makes demands of us.
Hmm.
Like so
Hmm.
he charges, he's not charging to save Beowulf. He knows he can't do that, or he believes he can't do that. He's charging to die because he owes that based on what he's been given, and not just the physical mail shirt, but the authority, the power that
Hmm.
goes with all that. I think that is a very powerful message sent to the powers that be. This is what we expect of you if you're going to accept these things. You
Hmm.
can't accept them and then not do this.
Yeah.
It is a story about values, and I think those values are pretty important. I'm not saying that you need to go off and die now. I am saying that's really crucial to think about when you accept those societal advantages over other people. You do have responsibilities with them. They
Yes.
don't need to be written.
Hmm.
And that to me is why Beowulf is still so important to be with us, because those concepts are crucial for the survival of our societies, our communities, and the fact that uh, Wiglaf does survive and succeeds in saving Beowulf. Beowulf does kill the dragon, but dies in the
Hmm.
fight. We don't have a super happy ending for Beowulf because again, Wiglaf goes on a little bit and says, "Now the Swedes will sharpen their swords when they hear about this cowardice that you guys engaged in. They're going to attack us." And he describes like not a kind of a grim future for the Geats. So it's like if your leaders act like this, that they take these things and then they do not act in accordance with their responsibilities, that is a sign of coming downfall for your
Hmm.
society. Again, this seems pretty universal to me. This
Yeah.
does not seem like it is very just period specific. And putting that in as having that as a constant theme, having that as something that is just very common to my heroes was important to me. So I didn't have to have them espouse every single heroic ideal of the time period, but they definitely are in line with those particular ideals.
Hmm.
Hmm. This idea
And
of reciprocity and responsibility
mhm,
and generosity being met with responsibility, especially from your kings or rulers, is entirely infused throughout legends spanning the world over, not just from this northern quadrant of Europe and the British Isles. So I think that's a really great way to kind of get into the heads of these heroes and how figuring out how to demonstrate good behavior based on these relationships is just a really interesting way to approach that. And that's also supported by the material culture that we can see. And I think that, approaching it from that way makes a lot of sense and it will help flesh things out, even for modern readers. And it's a great way to demonstrate those relationships.
It's almost as if we humans, say to our leaders, yeah, yeah, you can sit in that golden castle over there for a bit, but
Mhm.
we're gonna need something from you if you want to
Yeah,
do
well, it's
that.
eso te gillisguf. A gift demands a gift in return.
Yep.
So, yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, and so, with that, what you're then also telling us as modern readers, um, well, you're telling us, how to think about these characters, these Vikings essentially, right? Like you're giving us a guideline for understanding their motivations, and and how things come about essentially in this period that we love to mythologize, that we love
Mhm.
to romanticize, right? And we love to uh basically create a bunch of narratives about. So can you speak more to that too?
Oh, well, some people are creating narratives that really are not consistent at all with the values of the Viking Age. And that's a trouble with people who either don't know a whole lot about it, about the mythology, about the language, about the history, or do and don't care because they know they can make a buck off of it. And I mean, Vikings are hot. Vikings have
Mhm.
been hot for a long time. Uh, I don't know exactly why. I guess I could offer a couple of guesses, but I think that's maybe immaterial. I do think that part of why I started writing the books and a theme throughout was I wanted to push back against the false narratives that are in there
Mm.
and offer the real narratives. The real narratives are so much more awesome, are so much more cool, have so much more wisdom, and are so much more valuable. The Valhall death cults, where it's all about rah, 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 fight, die in battle, talked about by people who are conspicuously not dying in battle. That's interesting. It's they're forwarding, I think, many of these people. This is very broadly speaking, but I am okay with generalizing here.
Mhm.
Broadly speaking, a lot of people are trying to take the Viking Age and use that to justify what are really more modern notions of masculinity that are fairly toxic, uh,
Mhm.
certainly don't make a lot of sense, and want to make men primary and keep women secondary. And you can find, bits and pieces of support in that in saga literature and some of these writings, but you can often find it hinting at influence by the writers. And the writers were writing in the 13th century, and they were not pagans or heathens or really believers in any sense. They were not writing the script of Beowulf in order to preserve Beowulf's wisdom. Although I do think the scribe of Beowulf knew what he was doing, or the scribes rather, because it was multiple people. Uh,
Mhm.
some of them are trying to say that, uh, even justify slavery through the taking of thralls or, treating women as secondary, basically objects. So let's just back up real quick. There are at least three sagas where they say outright, like, it's dishonorable to take thralls.
Mhm.
And in the same sagas, they generally are like, yeah, we won't be taking women against their will. Like, that's just wrong. Say that pretty explicitly in Arrow Odd Saga. In fact, it's not suggested by Arrow Odd himself. I believe that's put forward by his friend Hjalmar the Brave. But Odd immediately says, like, oh, yeah, those are good rules. So
Oh,
these,
it sorry to interrupt here, but this is actually quite interesting to consider, right? Like we have this very set idea about the Viking Age as
yeah,
this period where everybody has a slave.
yeah,
The entire economy is centered around slavery. There's definitely a lot of that happening for sure.
Mhm.
Um, but imagine that maybe there were different sentiments about that. Maybe people had different opinions, right?
Mhm.
Like
yeah.
maybe you see some some places they ban slavery. I don't know actually because I don't know how we would check that against verifiable evidence. But maybe that was a thing. Maybe that actually happened. Who knows, right? And it's like really fascinating to hear, uh, uh, you know, about like sagas that talk about how taking slaves is dishonorable because in the 13th century in medieval Iceland, that was a very common thing as well. Slavery was a thing in medieval Iceland after the conversion as well as it was in the rest of Scandinavia and plenty of places in Europe, right? Um, Mostly that type of slavery came about as debt slaves, right? Tenant slaves and so on. But yeah, like, I mean, there must have been, you know, variations and um, differences of opinions in these basic subjects as well, right? And again, this comes back to then how we love to stereotype about the Viking Age and say, oh, these people were just like that, or these people were just like that, and this is how they did things, and everybody was this like big macho warrior if they weren't some kind of submissive woman or some dumb shit like that.
Yeah, everybody was not uniform for sure. I mean, just think about that for a second. Do we really need to say like, well, they wouldn't have acted like this because we've have archaeological evidence indicating that they had thralls, and so all of them would no, no. And in fact, look at the sagas. Like, not this is not your working class literature, first of all.
Yeah.
I mean, these were what primarily about people who had some money, who had some money,
Hmm.
some land, and some power. And even with that bias, you have all these sagas saying, "No, actually, this is not okay."
Hmm. Yeah.
That's really saying something.
Yeah, it is.
That's not like, you know, some like left wing like Mother Jones saying like maybe socialism is a good idea. That's like the Wall Street Journal saying the
Yeah,
maybe socialism is a good
it's
idea.
very
So
top
consider,
down.
yeah.
Yeah.
No, I was just going to say it's coming from the ones who would ostensibly benefit from it the most. It's coming from the higher ups from the elite class. And we can assume quite a bit of diversity of opinion if these are surviving in these texts, because that's already a very limited source. And so the fact that we do have so many examples of this is coming down to us now that we can point to probably points to a lot more diverse opinions as well, even just in that small strata of society about which the sagas are written and for whom the sagas are written. So I think it's really important to kind of help us rethink this era and what that social landscape would have looked like.
Yeah, we also should consider that the people who were enthralled due to economic factors because they owed debts,
Mhm.
probably didn't want to be.
Mhm.
I mean, it shouldn't be that hard to make that conclusion, and yet that's part of it. Then again, I think in many ways in the U.S. we're working very well on starting to make people debt slaves or going in that direction, and I don't think people really want to do that. So let's think about that very explicitly and consider that the people who are doing all the work or the manual labor who are making all these things go, who didn't have ships to go on and sail on adventures, they have stories too, or they had stories too. And those stories probably didn't sound a ton like what all these different saga or legendary sagas sound like, where they're like, well, what are you going to do? You're not doing anything. You're just a coal biter right now. Well, I think I'll go off and kill this troll and or maybe this dragon. And I love those sagas, but there are other stories to be told. And the thing to remember is that a lot of those stories are just very much more plain and we're not told over and over again and then we're not written down. But those people still existed and they were still just as important. Again, it comes back to kind of having empathy and thinking about the different social stratifications and the different experiences of different people. And then just applying that to, I do it, applying to my own life. Like, how would I feel about this? Not so great if it comes down to having to just take orders from somebody for paying off my debt, where I don't really have social mobility or physical mobility or even the ability to, you know, just move around a little bit. Reconceiving the Viking world means, I think, reconceiving it as not just Vikings, because remember, Vikings were just, they're just the raiders.
Yep.
So I try to use the term Viking correctly in my books.
Mm.
But I'm a little looser in the blurbs. The blurbs are marketing copy. But my heroes, they're not actually Vikings. They're not raiding towns. They're not looking for easy pickings. They're not doing that. They're doing more like legendary saga stuff, heroic stuff. And to those guys, let's recall, hitting on the easy pickings would be pretty dishonorable. It would be pretty cowardly. Like, why are you doing that? Drengers look for equal opponents or harder. Your size or bigger, that's who you challenge. And
Mhm.
Mhm.
that was a part of that. That does not fit with either the description of, quote unquote Vikings today by the very casual or the your typical masculine mindset put forward by a few certain influencers I can think of who definitely forward the idea that you should win at any cost. You can't win all the time or at any cost if
Mhm.
you're challenging nobody but your size or bigger, your experience or longer, your skill or better. It's the people who challenge things. Oh my gosh, they're vulnerable. They're making themselves vulnerable to loss when they
Mhm.
do that. And that is a Viking Age ideal. And
Yeah, for
that
sure.
is, yeah. And that is
Yeah.
not something that is quite as well put forward and that which I did want to put forward.
Yeah. No, yeah, like I mean, it's very much in the basics of all of this, right? Like if you have an easy time, you don't become a hero, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
And one of the things, speaking of popular Viking fictions, right? The Northmen, one of the things that has always bugged me, well, there's actually a lot of things that has bugged me about that representation of Vikings, but one of the things that has always bugged me is this situation where they're out in the east, right? They're somewhere in Russia
Yep.
and they're like sailing on a ship, and then one of the psychopaths on the ships just like shoots an arrow at some guy and his son. They're like loading on a boat and kills the son, and they're all like sitting on the boat going ho 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 ho, and it's like what a load of bullshit. Like, I mean, sure, yeah, I'm sure you can find psychopaths like that in the Viking Age, just like you can now. But again, going back to, ideals, going back to talking about, um, having guidelines for life and existence and what it means to be a Viking warrior and what it means to be, masculine, essentially, right? We can see that that is not something that would have been considered appropriate or cool or awesome or anything to that effect. To the contrary, what we typically see is that those kinds of people in the saga literature, people who act like that, are the ones that nobody like.
Mhm.
They are the ones that our hero kills, right?
Mhm.
So, you know,
There's definitely this idealization of berserks or berserkir and or berserkers if you want to maybe the most common way of talking about them. It's kind of silly, and this is why I put this into the books is like I have a berserker as one of the crew, and he doesn't like the term. He won't let anybody use it. But is he immune to iron? Yeah, pretty much. Does he get sleepy after a fight? Yes, he does. And when Ansgar is the protagonist of the series, realizes this, he's like, "Holy shit, Crocky's a berserker." And one of the other characters tells him, like, "You better not use that term around him." It's like, well, he just fell asleep. Like he fell asleep because he's old. Like Crocky is extremely elderly. And he's like, well, he just shrugged off that axe blade. And he's like, yeah, he grew up with dwarves. Like
mm.
that's who raised him. He has like stone-like skin. So I'm giving different qualities for those things where the traditional saga literature, Berserkir are immune to maybe fire and iron. At the same time, how do Berserkir die in the sagas? Well, there's usually 12 of them, not all the time. And when they get killed, they get killed by one singular hero almost
Mhm.
always.
Hmm.
Uh, it's two in well, I guess Arrow Odd Saga, and then there's bleed over to Hervor and Haedrich Saga because Arrow Odd fights 11 of them, and his friend fights one who's wielding Tyrving the sword. But yeah, again, Arrow Odd yeah, they're immune to iron, so he beats them to death with a club, all 11 of them. That's not the only instance of that happening. So Berserkir in the sagas, in the legends, in the myths, they're not these awesome. Certainly not. They're not elite in any sense of that word. Fighters. They're not very well liked.
Mhm. Exactly. They're not liked at all.
Yeah.
So, with that, do you think they ever actually existed, or are they just a feature of the fiction about the Viking Age?
Oh, I don't think they're just a feature of fiction, but I don't think that they existed the way people portray them now, certainly. And I'm not sure that they existed the way that the even the sagas necessarily portrayed them. I Neil Price makes an allusion to so first of all, there's Berserk here, and I'm not entirely certain that Ulfhednar are really different, or if they're kind of just a different word describing sort of the same thing. Again, we don't have a lot of description either way. Matthias, you may know much more than I have, but I read enough that I was satisfied that there's just a lot of ambiguity there. So what Neil Price mentioned was, they're actually skirmishers from the Roman Empire who dressed as in wolf gear,
Hmm.
and they were a little bit wilder than some of the others. As skirmishers, they weren't, I don't think, fighting in quite that same disciplined line. And I don't remember what they were called because, and I don't unfortunately have his textbook with me, but it's worth considering some of these ideas, including Berserkir, didn't originate in Scandinavia,
Hmm.
but may have come from way back in the way back. Could have come from the Roman auxiliaries. Could have been a feature of something further back. Certainly, fighting without armor. If you translate berserk as bear shirt, as in no shirt, rather than the shirt of a bear, which I think the jury is still out on what that word means. You have people fighting in no armor because there's no armor around as you get earlier and earlier in history. And so, how far back does this idea go? Does it go back to very, very old Germanic tribes that were more like fighting the Roman Empire? Does it go that far back, or is it something that kind of came out of legend, maybe even during the migration period after the long winter of the mid 530s, where I think a lot of things probably changed after that. A lot of stories morphed.
Hmm.
Was it because people encountered wild men in the forests who were wearing bear skins and who were raiding them? Were basically Vikings with no ships and no crews
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
who were
I think
semi-feral. I mean, any of
I
those things could be.
yeah, no, I think you're right. I have a couple of suggestions. One of them is that, what we see with the Roman armies is that innovation happens, of course,
Hmm.
but quite often there's a contingent of the Roman army that doesn't necessarily accept that innovation. And that becomes, tradition within the army. Hence the skirmishers, right? The scouts who wear the wolf pelts. That seems to have become some kind of tradition over time. Maybe because uh, they've were special forces, right? Saw themselves as special compared to the foot soldiers, and I don't know that much about Roman auxiliary troops to fully be able to talk to that, but or to speak to that, but I think there's something to that effect, and And this could also very well be a situation in north of the Roman line, right, where you have Germanic populations. You have some who consider themselves more elites and therefore will perhaps fight without armor to show just how badass they are. You also have some who fight without armor because they can't afford armor. That is a very common theme. If we look at the material remains of a very big Germanic army at the Danish site Ilorup Ådal, where you have about 1,000 warriors, right? Um, Pretty much none of these warriors have any armor.
Hmm.
What they have is linen clothing and shields and spears and some swords here and there. That's it. Then I think it's like one or two of them were, very clearly the generals or whatever you want to call it, and they had horses too. So you have, uh, out of 1,000 people, you have two individuals who have, you know, some kind of like protective gear sitting on horses, and then the rest of them are basically just, people with shields and spear.
Yeah.
Um, so, and
Yeah.
if we get to the Viking Age, right, like let's consider just how many resources go into, you know, uh, um, creating a chainmail armor,
Yeah.
and dressing an entire person up with that, plus all the padding that you would want to have as well, and helmets and so on and so forth. And at the end of the day, you know what? If you can't afford that, then the best thing you can do is some kind of war magic and then go naked into battle. You know?
Yeah. Or just to consider, like, I'm that much more bad. I will show how badass I am by charging in without armor, and like, hey, I'm gonna be, maybe if they've heard the story, I'm gonna be like Beowulf when he fights
Mm,
Grendel. Because remember, he strips down like, oh, this monster doesn't have any weapons. I better take my armor off and fight
hmm
him barehanded. And if that was, a very old story told to different people, I can imagine. I mean, just imagine. I don't think males were that different going back in history. Like, we tell stories and then we kind of want to emulate them
Yeah.
sometimes.
mm,
So it's certainly a possibility that a lot of these factors came together in different ways to create the potentially, I don't know, when can we even date the canonical Berserker to a time when it was kind of first, like, okay, so this is when it was written down and became
Mhm.
canon. I'm not even sure when that would be. I guess it would be sometime in the 1300s though, and those people
Well,
would be looking back.
we have the depictions, right, of what is either an Ulfhedna or a berserker, right? This one like bear dancer,
Mhm.
on this little tablet that was inserted on a helmet from Sweden. Is it Vendel or Valsierra? I can't remember, but one of these two locations, these uh primary, very important locations that give us like really interesting insight into the especially the warrior culture of the 5 to 600s. That's when that is from. I think it's from the early 600s. So, so that would be like the earliest example of a depiction. And then we have
Mhm.
those later stories. Um, you know,
So we have to
yeah.
decide, does that depiction depict the same ideas that we had written down a
hmm
lot later, or was it a much different idea back then? And not to say that it necessarily was, it could have been very, very similar, but we don't have a guarantee of that. Then that's that
No.
tolerance for ambiguity that I was talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you
Yeah.
also, again, you do have this fusion of cultures, and you have Romans and Greek sources writing about Celts going into battle naked with nothing but
Yes.
their torques and their swords. So I wouldn't be surprised if there was some influence from that. Whether or not that's even true, because as we know, Romans really like to exaggerate certain exoticisms about people they encountered that weren't Roman or Greek. But even if that kind of morsel of rumor had been spread and had kind of taken form in any of these stories, it could have either influenced the stories, if not even the behavior. So there
Well,
are threads to be picked at there.
yeah, I think there's a very strong thread. I'm not going to attempt to pronounce his name, but I mean, I think you can probably fill in for this. But
Cuchulainn.
if the story of the Hound of Cullen got
Cuchulainn.
down to
Yeah.
there,
His
yes.
Riestrad. Yeah. Matthias and I were
Um,
talking about this recently. His warp spasm.
Mhm.
Yes, the warp spasm is described in a lot more detail than the berserker state of mind, but
Hmm.
I think that could be a stylistic difference rather than
Yeah.
a substantial difference. Like his knees go backwards, and I mean, there's a
Yeah.
bunch of
His
graphic novels that actually portray what the text says, and
yes.
they're kind of freaky.
It's pretty impressive. His hair stands up so that if apples were to fall on it, they would all be speared before they could touch his scalp. His mouth opens up so wide that you can see his liver flapping about. One eye gets so small that it's the size of a needle, and the other one gets bigger than a dinner platter, and it's a really shocking description. But if that's anything to go off of, then there is quite a tradition of this kind of war frenzy or this battle fury that turns men into something other than men.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, and I would expect warrior societies of these kinds to create exactly those kinds of stories,
Mhm.
right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's you for as you were pointing out, Greg, first and foremost to, you know, inspire, but also just, in at the end of the day, perhaps to also just like talk about talk about it, so to speak, right? Like
Mhm.
process the fight, process the battle, process the blood and gore and grimness of it all, you know?
Mhm.
Yeah, thinking about those stories to inspire or to validate, like to say, you know, hey, I'm sane or you're sane. This is often how the world is. And I
Mm,
think those are two very common threads in fantasy literature. They're often written to inspire. This is what we would like to see in the world, these heroes, or to validate, like, oh wow, this is grim
mm,
and pretty dark. But you know what? I'm telling a story about it, and it parallels the reality that you're living, and that means that if I see am seeing the same thing you're seeing, you are validated as a reader, even though you just read a story that is just dark and depressing and
Yeah.
mm.
does not end well. I write the inspirational part. I
Yeah.
don't do the validation so much of the things are terrible. I would like to validate that there are some people who see craziness in the world and react like, that's crazy. We're not going to do that.
Yeah. I appreciate that. I think that's much needed.
Mhm.
There's a lot of crazy stuff going on these days, so
So that's very welcome. Thank you for that. I am a huge fantasy reader, and I have talked to one of my very good friends, wrote a few, two books. She has two books out, and one of them is historical fiction based on the sagas. And I haven't read, hers is the only other book that I've read. Genevieve Gonachek is who I'm talking about.
Oh,
Her Weaver and the Witch Queen.
yeah.
Other than her, I haven't, and the excerpts of your books that I've read, I haven't really delved into much historical fiction around the Viking Age. I think since I spend so much time there for my research, it's kind of the last thing that I really reach for when I want escapism. But in reading the source material, there's quite a bit of humor and levity that doesn't often make it into a lot of the historical fiction. And it seems that you are trying to bring some of that in a way that a modern audience could appreciate. And I was wondering if you could kind of talk about how you can talk about these like grim, dark, crazy times with a bit of levity that still carries a tone of these historical sources, but would translate to a modern reader.
Yeah. Oh, so first of all, Genevieve Gornichek, I did read The Witch's Heart,
Mm-hmm.
and though I am very much against the whole Loki is an okay guy idea,
Mm.
I quite liked what she did. You could tell that Genevieve Gornichek really knew what she was talking about.
Yeah.
And so that was a novel that took it in a different direction that I don't really like and was a lot about romance, which I don't read. And I would still very much recommend it.
Mm.
I think she's a great author. I'd love to talk to her sometime. But for the levity, the humor, every book should include at least a little bit of humor. I mean, we're talking about human beings, and human beings do have senses of humor. That doesn't mean that the prose needs to be humorous. In fantasy literature, I think you have Terry Pratchett on one end, who gives you
Mm-hmm.
a constant stream of humorous prose. There are some other authors who are doing it very well, who aren't quite that consistent, but are still
Mm-hmm.
noted for the humor in their prose and dialogue. I would point out my favorite author right now, Christopher Buehlman, author of The
Mm.
Black Tongue Thief and The Daughter's War, among others. Nicholas Ames, who wrote Kings of the Wild and Bloody Rose. And there are a few others doing a very good job. J. Zachary Pike is a
Mm-hmm.
great indie fantasy author, writing in a very D&D style, and he's using more satire. When I used humor, I realized when I read Tom Shippey's book Laughing Shall I Die,
Mm.
the deaths of the great Vikings. He dissects a lot of the humor in the sagas, and I realized when he laid it out so explicitly, oh my God, this is my sense of humor. This has
Mm.
always been my sense of humor. Those different parts of it, and a lot of this is it's very dry. It tends to be dark. It
Mm-hmm.
can be self-deprecating, but only if there's like gore or violence involved. It involves a lot of ambiguity and word plays, and the more esoteric, the better. Now that part I don't reconstruct because that's just going to make it torture for the reader. If
Yes.
I do use kennings and Haiti and alliteration in my books, I do not use the kind of kennings that are just torture to try to pick apart and understand. While I like some of those things, I think that making it hard for the reader to understand what the reader is reading leads to a bad storytelling experience. So
Mm.
I don't really do that. So as I was doing this, I realized much of my humor was consistent with saga humor. I use a little bit more of it. I use a little, but I do I do lean into the dirty stuff sometimes. But none of this is inconsistent with saga humor. Not the poop jokes, not the sex jokes, not the violent, dark, grim stuff, and not the very dry, kind of droll, laconic humor. And it's not just important to show humanity. It's a way of breaking up prose. Like as far as craft goes, you're writing description maybe, or you're writing part of the narrative, and you're trying to show as much as you can without telling. But as you go through longer paragraphs, some things that break up longer paragraphs are dialogue.
Mm.
They also make it run faster. What else makes things go a little bit faster during those slow parts? Well, a little bit of action, or a little bit of tension, or a little bit of humor. Michael Chabon has a really consistent low level of dry humor running through Gentlemen of the Road, which isn't fantasy, but it's got one guy, I don't want to say too much, like he's not a Viking at all, but he is wielding an axe with Viking Age runes,
Mm.
naming the axe Mother Defiler. So while these guys are both Jewish and I think they're way after the Viking, or a bit after the Viking Age, what he's doing is the same kind of thing. Is he's buoying the reader through the stuff, like you need to know this stuff, but if you describe it in like just a little bit of a humorous way, you really hook the reader. The reader wants to keep reading, wants to get a little bit more of that feeling, either chuckle or
Mhm.
just it makes the prose more interesting. And it's one of several techniques that you can that you can use to do that. So I keep it fairly authentic as far as the way that humor or the types of humor that are in there. And of course, it's with my voice and in a more modern voice, so it's presented differently. But I think that's how I do it and why I do it. And also, I find that to be my authentic way of telling those stories, probably because I internalized a lot of this. Like I was getting read Beowulf when I was 3 or 4 years old, and I'm still wondering what the effects of that were. But that's something that I enjoyed, and what I'm finding that a lot of the readers enjoy as well. So I'll probably keep doing that.
Good.
No, that's pretty cool. Yeah. No, I 3 or 4 years old. Yeah, that's around the same time I started with like the Nordic stuff as well.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't know that I was being read Beowulf, and so this is sorry, this is just a humorous story of my own early trauma. So I would get read this story like virtually every night, or at least every week, and I couldn't read, so I didn't realize that. And remember, Beowulf has 3 fights.
Mhm.
I only got read through the second fight. And then the story ended, and Beowulf was the king
Mm.
after he killed Grendel's mother. Well, the thing is, I requested this reading from an uncle who came over and was visiting, and like saw once a year. And he was like, "Yeah, I'll read you this book." Well, he read me the whole book, and then he's like, "Hey," and I was like, "That was good." And he said, "There's more here." I said, "What do you mean there's more? Have you been holding out on me? Tell me about this." And I got the third fight, and I was so pissed off because Beowulf dies. I was like, that's wrong. That story is wrong. I don't like that. What are you talking about? What's going on here? Blah, blah, blah. But at the same time, still, I still love the first 2 parts really well, really early.
I love that.
How old were you when you got your full Beowulf reading?
So young that I can't even remember, but before I could read at all. So I was not even in kindergarten. I think I might have been
Oh,
4or 5.
that's such a
It was,
rude
and
awakening.
I wish I still had that book because it had like a couple of pictures, but not too many.
Mm.
So I went on recently, like, can I find this book? Like, can I reconstruct my early childhood? And like, I'm really not sure. It was so long ago.
I love that. That's hilarious.
Cool.
Yeah, no, I've definitely had those kinds of experiences with texts as well, different kinds of like crazy Viking stories. Obviously like growing up with Scandinavian fiction that has been a little bit different um than this, we've had I mean, we've always had a lot of, fiction about Vikings, right? Obviously.
Yeah,
Um and we got these, um, epitomal works that that everybody knows, really. Like, um, what's one called? One of them is called, I think the translation would be something like the Red Serpent, right? And this is the typical Viking narrative where you follow this guy who, goes out and becomes a Viking, and then he becomes the coolest, most badass Viking around, and all that stuff. And then there's like stuff about Christianity and stuff about paganism, and that's one of those texts that inspires a lot of people to rethink a lot of things. I think most like heathens that I know in Denmark, they can say like that book made me rethink whether or not I wanted to stick with Christianity, essentially. So like that's one of the things that they typically do, these kinds of stories. Um, but yeah, obviously when it comes to like Scandinavian context, I would say that a lot of this stuff is also very much like directed towards our national narratives, because it's so important. Like the Viking Age is so important for Scandinavian self-conception, and the identity of Danes and Norwegians and Icelanders and so on, in particular. Not so much the Swedes, but it's still there with the Swedes, though, just not as much. I think that has probably changed nowadays. But back in the 80s and 90s, I don't think Sweden had that much. That's at least what I keep hearing from them. Poor souls. Um, but yeah, so we like a lot of it has like, these like very nationalistic implications, um, which, is both good and bad, of course.
Mhm.
Because again, there's nothing really about like Vikings that's like distinctly Scandinavian
Mhm.
in the sense that this is like, this is what makes up Norwegian identity. Like there is very little overlap between the type of life that people lived 1200 years ago in Norway and the type of life they live today,
Mhm.
right? So that's like another side of all of this when it comes to like conceptualizing Vikings, right? So we talked about masculinity, but we can also talk about other problems like, these Vikings represent a collective us if you come
Huh.
from this part of the world, right? And it's like,
Yeah.
not really.
Not
No,
really.
no, not at all. It's such a strange thing to hear people talk about Vikings as a they, or acting in a collective way, or hearing like in the series Vikings when Lagertha says like this shouldn't be Vikings fighting Vikings, again using it as an ethnic term.
Yeah.
It wasn't an ethnic term, and the people who made up Scandinavia and Germania and outlying regions did not consider themselves all as one. And I really wanted to point out, like I don't, when I write a fantasy book, I don't want to lecture to the reader. If you know about the Finnsburg fragment, then you know that the Danes and the Jutes, they really hated each other, and it was, even though they're very close together, like these are two different tribes and blah blah blah. Like can't do that. How What you can do is talk about different peoples. And the other thing you could do, and this is why I maybe fudge a little bit of the difference between East and West Norse, to make it slightly earlier than it was. But I was okay with that because I wanted to be like, yeah, these two people didn't really even speak quite the same language, or it was a
Mhm.
variant of the language. They were different. These people were different. They
Mhm.
were not all unified. They did not have a unifying identity or an element of unifying identity. They did have, the languages were mutually intelligible. They did have common stories, but you could get a different story crossing over the big hill to the east.
Mhm.
So the variance there in identity, in ways of looking at things, in stories told, was a big deal. That really pokes holes in this idea that is very modern, which is, this is a white identity, or if you're one of those people, the white identity that is, strong, and we should really be representing now. Well, I agree. We should have some more representation from that time period. I think it should be done authentically. I think you should look at concepts like Drengskaper and the way they thought about honor, and where their very different conception of fate from the way we
Mhm.
think of fate today, the way we think about luck today, and the way that they were willing to make themselves vulnerable, and the way they were willing to put themselves out there. I think those are really great. Those ideas are very opposite of what's being put forward by the nationalist types, though. The
Oh
nationalist
man.
types, though, are no.
No, it I had forgotten about that Lagertha comment of like Vikings fighting Vikings. Like I like literally every Norwegian king saga has like, you know, some moment where and then he went and harried the Danish coast or the Swedish coast or something like that, like with some Norwegian king. Or at that time, the Norwegian beaches were swarming with Danish Vikings who were, and that kind of stuff. And later on, um, they're talking about like in Danish and Swedish history writing, they're talking a lot about the Estonian Vikings. The Estonian Vikings have come over and are now like a problem, right? The term Viking to these people had never had anything to do with ethnicity,
No
No.
ethnic relationship
none
whatsoever.
whatsoever.
You
And
even
it,
get it outside of Scandinavia, people recognizing different groups of Scandinavians. You have the Fingenti and Duvgenti, or the Fingal and the Duvgal in Ireland, and they're aligning themselves with different Irish kings. They are taking over each other's camps. There's tons of fighting between different waves of the incoming Scandinavians. And so it was never something in the source material that was recognized as a unifying identity. It was just a functional word.
And then you have Scottish Vikings too, right? Like,
Yeah,
which
you
are
have
Irish.
yep, you have the yeah, because the Scots are Irish, and it's important to remember that. And then you have the whole complicated issue of the Galgoidal, the
hmm
foreign
Uh-huh.
Gaels, who are
hmm
the combined culture of Norse Gaelic speakers, or Gaelic speakers who maybe allied themselves with the incoming Scandinavians, or Scandinavians who could speak Gaelic. We don't really, it's such a complex term, but again,
hmm
not really applicable to as an ethnicity.
Mm-mm. No,
The
and
amount, yeah.
sorry, go ahead, Greg.
Oh, I was just going to say the amount of diversity that would really go into that word is something that certain people would want to avoid.
Yes.
Also, diversity, also a word that my former coworkers at the FBI no longer allowed to use
Mm,
due
Ah,
to freedom of speech being so important, apparently. But that's just an aside.
right.
Diversity, though, is real, and diversity was real. And
yeah.
it was diversity of cultures, language, ways of thinking, many different things. It was not a bunch of white super or Scandinavian supermen that is what is to be aspired to now somehow.
Yeah,
Yes.
no, it's yeah, it's such a watered down perception of the time and the peoples and the periods. Like, and it's interesting that you mentioned the Danes and the Jutes hated each other. I mean, yeah, that's like Denmark. Basically the two populations of what is modern day Denmark. Denmark back then was bigger than it is now. But you have like the populations on the archipelago. That's the Danes, and their original quote unquote homeland was southern Sweden. And
Mhm.
then you have the Jutes on the other side, on the peninsula, and they had a different identity that's almost gone now.
Yep.
I belong to the Jutes and not the Danes, even though nobody would know that if they
Yeah.
were looking at it from the outside, right? And it's still, when we speak with our dialects in Copenhagen, people make fun of us, right?
Mhm.
That's still present to this day. But that's really it. That's the extent to which there's like a quote unquote tribal difference, right? And then you have that go through the Scandinavian peninsula and you can see that especially in the old municipal names, the different municipalities in Norway are literally named after different tribes. I
Mm.
think they reconfigured their municipalities recently. But if you go back to what it looked like, 10 years ago or 10,
Mm.
15 years ago, it would like be those like municipalities would literally be named after different tribal identities. And um there's like a multitude of ways in which the Scandinavian realm is also like split up, right?
Hmm.
Um, you know, Norway and Sweden, as these modern countries exist on a peninsula, it looks very unified today, right? But if you think about it, back in the Viking Age, that mountain range that goes down like straight through the peninsula, that's a massive barrier.
Yeah.
That's
Yes.
a like this is not just something you move through.
Hmm.
Like if you're a Viking, what you want to do is you want to be on a ship
Yep.
because that's the easiest and quickest way to get around. Which
Yep.
means then that all of these coastal locations around Norway are closely linked with each other, just like they're very closely linked with Danish and Swedish coastal
Mhm.
locations. And then the inland is an entirely different beast altogether. And this is
Mhm.
something that we see all the time too in the saga literature. They talk about like, oh, now Skallagrimsson has to like go through the mountains and like collect taxes on behalf of the king up somewhere in bumfuck nowhere. And then he runs into, well, we're basically what we were talking about a little bit before, Greg, before we started recording. You basically run into the creepy backwoods hillbillies that like the saga writers have that same feeling about these people who live in the mountains and in the deep woods as we see in folk horror that likes to rag on rural populations today.
Yeah, and if those people are, understood a certain way, you just call them, witches or something else, or full of trolls. Trolls
Hmm.
being a really generic term at the time, rather than these big mountainous
Yep.
creatures. Because that's what the term turned into, but it wasn't. That's not the term it's used from the Viking Age or before.
No. No, actually, it means it has some connotations of magic, right?
Hmm.
Because
Mhm.
the derived verb trylla means to make magic.
Mm.
So there is something interesting going on there. And yeah, and one of the other terms that we often see, which is cognate or kind of cognate with troll and people who do sorcery and such, Finn, right?
Mhm.
Hmm.
And this is where it then becomes like an ethnic thing as well. And these coastal Germanic populations are looking at inland populations that speak Finno-Ugric languages like the Sami and so on, and then they're, you know, um, coming up with a bunch of weird ideas about them.
Yeah, which is understandable again from the layout of, or the mythological layout of the world. If we take Midgard is in, well, if you have the encircling sea, all around, and then you have what's around, what's on the coast of the encircling sea is the realms of the giants. I still, I've read this stuff for over 30 years and I still come up on things that I realize like, oh, I had this slightly wrong. So it's actually more properly Jotunheimar rather than Jotunheim, realms of the
Yeah.
giants, rather, or the Jotun,
Yep.
or rather than simply realm. So it wouldn't be considered like a nation. It's like a bunch of different places. But
Mhm.
that's those are the coastal areas around the encircling sea, and then Midgard is contained within as like this barrier uh, for kind of the gods, like
Hmm.
so in one sense, we humans are like cannon fodder for the eventual fight. In
Mhm.
they don't say that, but I kind of like, well, I go for implications a lot. So if you're around there, if you're on a sea that seems very unpopulated, if you're around those coastal areas that just seem treacherous, mountainous, you might consider yourself on the edge of the encircling sea, and you might look at that land as like, this is one of the realms of the giants.
Mhm.
And then you've got these Finns, and they're doing sorcery. It's like, oh wow, yeah, this is a dangerous place. That sense of foreignness, I can definitely see that as a sense of understanding things.
Mhm.
Maybe not quite literally. It's hard to replicate exactly how everybody thought of the geography at the time, but that's how it's represented as far as the mythology, at least.
Mhm.
Yeah, no, there's definitely something to that, right? Like, however that might have looked, maybe not as schematic as it's being put in the literature that we have surviving, but yeah, it's it conveys, sentiments, anxieties, and uncertainties, and those kinds of things, right?
Yeah.
Awesome. We have been talking for quite a while. Actually, it's been a very interesting conversation. To wrap up, Greg, do you want to tell people how they can find you, what kinds of things you're doing, besides, of course, publishing your books?
What am I doing besides publishing my books? Not a whole lot because that takes so much time. But the easiest way to find me is at my website, amatoauthor.com. I am working on getting my web shop up, so soon you'll be able to buy books direct from me, including copies of Fall into Fury before retailers have it. Those will also be signed when I sell books direct. I always sign them. And not that the web shop is up yet, but it will be very soon. The other thing to do is just on the website, sign up for my newsletter. I don't send a ton. I try to have good copy in there that's interesting to read rather than just buy my books. And
Mhm.
it usually deals with stuff from, that dealing with that northern thing, Norse stuff mostly, fantasy stuff, mythology stuff. There was one time when I was just, I was watching Andor, and there's actually a bunch of Norse kind of sentiment in Andor, in two characters in particular. And so I'll write stuff about that as well as recommendations, good other good authors. I recommend a few pretty consistently, like Christopher Buehlman, Scott Oden, who's also written Norse fantasy, a few others. And occasionally I will point people toward some research or papers that explain things in a more factual way that I think will help enlighten them. So yeah, my website, my newsletter are probably the best ways to go. I'm not great at social media. I'm on some social media. You can do that if you want.
I'd say that's a great character trait if you're not great at social media.
I keep telling myself that.
And what about you, Amina? How can people find you?
Oh gosh, I'm also not great at social media, and I have a really weird Instagram handle. It's you can follow me at Whalehref, Waelhref. It means battle fox or slaughter fox. It's a portmanteau of Old English and Old Norse, so it's not linguistically correct. You can find me on Facebook with just my name, Amina Otto. And this podcast is a great way to hear me talk about things.
That is correct. It is. Yeah. Of course, always give us a follow on pretty much any social media platform. You can find us
Yep.
on Blue
Instagram, Blue
Sky, Instagram,
Sky,
yeah,
Facebook, TikTok.
TikTok, and
Mhm.
also you can watch us on YouTube. If you want to see us sit here staring at each other, picking our noses, that kind of stuff, you can watch us on YouTube. And also always hit that like button, comment, subscribe,
Mhm.
and sign up for our Patreon as well to support us. I think that's pretty much
Yes.
it. And of course, you can find me, Mathias Nordvig, by my name, Mathias Nordvig, on Instagram as well. Thank you very much for listening, everybody. And
Thank
thank you, Greg, for
you.
joining us.
Thank
Yes,
you for
thank you
having me
for
again.
such a
Yeah.
fun conversation. This was amazing.
Yeah.